The dust kicked up from my boots as I walked toward the old barn, keys jangling in my weathered hands. 3 months had passed since Uncle Pete died, leaving me his ranch in Montana, a place I hadn't visited since childhood. The lawyer's words echoed in my mind. The barn's been empty for years, just old farming equipment. The massive wooden doors groaned against their hinges as I pushed them open. Shafts of golden afternoon light cut through the darkness, illuminating dancing dust motes. The smell hit me immediately, that distinct combination of aged wood, hay, and something else I couldn't quite place, something that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The barn was larger than I remembered, with a high loft running along 3 walls. Below, scattered farming equipment sat covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. Rusted tools hung from hooks, and old feed sacks were piled in the far corner. But it was those feed sacks that caught my attention. They were stacked too neatly, too purposefully, as if someone had arranged them to hide something. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to investigate. That's when I saw it. A corner of weathered wood peeking out from beneath the burlap. My heart began to race as I pulled the sacks away, one by one, until I uncovered what lay hidden beneath. It was a wooden chest, old and ornate, with brass fittings that had turned green with age. The chest was locked, but the wood around the latch had rotted enough that I could pry it open with my pocket knife. The hinges shrieked as I lifted the lid, and what I found inside would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Inside the chest lay dozens of letters, tied together with faded ribbons. The paper was yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to a pale brown. My hands trembled as I lifted the first bundle and untied the ribbon. The letter was addressed to my dearest Margaret in handwriting I didn't recognize. But the signature at the bottom made my blood run cold. It was signed Pete, in the same scrawling hand I'd seen on birthday cards throughout my childhood. I read the first letter, then the second, then a third. Each one revealed a passionate love affair that had lasted for decades. Margaret wasn't a name I recognized from family stories, and Uncle Pete had never married. According to family law, he'd been a confirmed bachelor his entire life. The letters spanned 40 years from the 1950s to the 1990s. They spoke of secret meetings, stolen moments, and a love that had to remain hidden. But hidden from whom? And why? As I continued reading, the pieces began to form a picture that didn't make sense. Margaret had been married to someone else, someone whose name appeared frequently in the letters, always with fear and trepidation, someone called him, or your husband, never by name. The later letters grew more desperate. Margaret wrote of bruises that had to be hidden, of threats that kept her awake at night, of wanting to leave but having nowhere to go. Uncle Pete's responses were filled with rage and promises to take her away from it all. Then, in 1993, the letters stopped abruptly. At the bottom of the chest, beneath all the correspondence, I found something that made my hands shake. It was a newspaper clipping from the local paper dated October 15, 1993. The headline read, "Local woman dies in barn fire." The woman's name was Margaret Richardson, and according to the article, she died when her husband's barn caught fire during the night. I couldn't sleep that night. The letters and newspaper clipping lay spread across Uncle Pete's kitchen table as I paced the floor, trying to make sense of what I'd discovered. Margaret Richardson had died in a barn fire, but the timing was too convenient. Her last letter to Uncle Pete, dated just a week before her death, spoke of finally finding the courage to leave her husband. The next morning, I drove into town to visit the local library. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, helped me access the newspaper archives from 1993. I found several follow-up articles about Margaret's death, each revealing more disturbing details. The fire had started around midnight. Margaret's husband, Thomas Richardson, claimed he'd been asleep in the house, and woke to find the barn engulfed in flames. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, it was too late. Margaret's body was found near the barn's entrance, apparently overcome by smoke while trying to escape. But what struck me as odd was that Margaret had been in the barn at all. According to Thomas, she'd gone out to check on a sick calf. In the middle of the night, alone. The final article I found was dated a month after the fire. It was Thomas Richardson's obituary. He died of a heart attack just weeks after his wife's funeral. The obituary mentioned that he'd been distraught since Margaret's death and had been drinking heavily. I spent the afternoon driving to what remained of the Richardson farm. It wasn't hard to find. The locals still remembered the tragedy. The house had been torn down years ago, but the foundation was still visible, overgrown with weeds and saplings. Where the barn had once stood, there was nothing but a blackened patch of earth that even 30 years later, nothing would grow on. Standing in that desolate place, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. Something terrible had happened here, and I was beginning to suspect that Uncle Pete knew more about it than his letters revealed. I returned to Uncle Pete's ranch with more questions than answers. That evening I went back to the barn and searched more thoroughly. If Pete had hidden one chest, perhaps there were others. I moved equipment, checked behind every beam, and climbed into the loft to search among the old hay bales. In the northeast corner of the loft, I found loose floorboards. Beneath them was another hiding place, this one containing a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, spanning decades. Most showed Uncle Pete and a woman I now knew was Margaret Richardson. The early photos showed them young and happy, stealing moments together at county fairs, picnics, and secluded spots around the county. But as I progressed through the chronological collection, I watched Margaret change. Her smile became forced, then disappeared entirely. In the later photos, she wore long sleeves even in summer heat, and her eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of unspeakable fear. The final photograph in the collection stopped me cold. It showed Margaret with a black eye and split lip, looking directly at the camera with a mixture of desperation and determination. On the back, in Uncle Pete's handwriting, were the words, "The last time I saw her alive, October 8th, 1993. October 8th was exactly 1 week before the barn fire. Beneath the photographs was a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map of the Richardson property. Certain areas were marked with X's, and one location, near where the barn had stood, was circled multiple times in red ink. I stared at that map until my eyes burned. What had Uncle Pete marked? What had he known about Margaret's death that never made it into the official investigation? The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to dig. I borrowed a metal detector from a friend in town, claiming I was looking for old farm equipment that might have been buried over the years. The lie came easily, but it sat heavy in my stomach as I drove back to the Richardson property. The current landowner, a developer named Carson, who'd bought the property to build a subdivision, gave me permission to metal detect for a small fee. He seemed amused by my interest in old junk and warned me not to fall into any old wells or root cellars. Following Uncle Pete's map, I made my way to the area where the barn had once stood. The metal detector remained silent as I swept it back and forth across the blackened earth. But when I moved to the spot marked with red circles, the machine began beeping frantically. I'd brought a shovel, expecting to find old horseshoes or farm tools. What I found instead, 3 feet down in the hard-packed soil, was a human skull. I sat back on my heels, staring at the yellowed bone in my hands. The skull showed clear signs of trauma, a crack that ran from the temple to the back of the head, the kind of injury that could only come from a violent blow. This wasn't Margaret Richardson. According to the newspaper accounts, her body had been cremated after the fire. This was someone else, someone who'd been buried in secret on the Richardson farm. As the implications sank in, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or you'll join them." I looked around the empty field, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. My truck was parked a quarter-mile away, and the nearest neighbor was even farther. Whoever had sent that message was watching me. I carefully reburied the skull and filled in the hole, my hands shaking as I worked. Uncle Pete's map had led me to a murder victim, and someone didn't want that secret revealed. I didn't sleep for 3 days after finding the skull. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound outside made me reach for the shotgun I'd found in Uncle Pete's closet. The anonymous threat had shaken me more than I cared to admit. But I couldn't let it go. Someone had been murdered and buried in secret, and somehow my uncle had known about it. The responsible thing would have been to call the police, but I needed to understand the full truth first. I started researching missing persons from the area, going back to the 1970s. The library's microfiche collection was extensive, and Mrs. Chen helped me navigate the old newspaper databases. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 50 years, at least 6 people had gone missing in the county. Most were women. All had connections to domestic violence situations, and none of their cases had ever been solved. The disappearances were spread out over decades, with no apparent pattern. But when I plotted them on a map, a pattern emerged. All 6 women had lived within a 20-mile radius of the Richardson farm. I was studying the timeline when Mrs. Chen approached my table with a concerned expression. "Excuse me," she whispered, "but there's been a man asking about you. He was here yesterday and again this morning, wanting to know what you've been researching." My blood ran cold. What did he look like? Older gentleman, maybe 65, with grey hair and a scar on his left cheek. Said he was an old friend of your uncle's. I didn't recognize the description, but the timing was too coincidental. Someone was definitely watching me, tracking my investigation. That night, I installed motion sensors around Uncle Pete's house and kept the shotgun loaded beside my bed. I was in too deep to turn back now, but I wasn't going to make it easy for whoever was trying to stop me. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos. She was young, maybe 35, with sharp eyes that missed nothing as she surveyed Uncle Pete's property. "I understand you've been asking a lot of questions around town," she said, settling into a chair on the front porch. "Questions about old cases, missing persons, that sort of thing." I tried to play it casual, but Santos had the kind of presence that made lying difficult. "Just trying to understand the area's history," I said. "My uncle never talked much about the past." Santos nodded slowly. "Your uncle was a good man, quiet, kept to himself, but always willing to help a neighbor." She paused, studying my face. "He also had a reputation for knowing things that other people preferred to keep buried." The double meaning wasn't lost on me. What kind of things? The kind that could get a person in trouble if they weren't careful. Santos stood and handed me her card. "I've been working these old missing persons cases for 3 years now. Started as a hobby, but it's become something of an obsession. If you find anything, and I mean anything that might help, I want you to call me." After she left, I sat on the porch for a long time, turning her card over in my hands. Deputy Santos knew more than she was letting on, and her visit felt less like a warning and more like an invitation. That evening, I made my decision. I called the number on her card. "I think you need to see something," I told her. We agreed to meet at the Richardson property the next morning. As I hung up, I caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line beyond Uncle Pete's pasture. Someone was definitely watching the house. Deputy Santos arrived at the Richardson property just after sunrise, bringing 2 things I hadn't expected: a portable ground-penetrating radar unit and a complete case file on the missing women. "I've been working this unofficially for years," she explained, as we walked to the area where I'd found the skull. 6 women, All disappeared under suspicious circumstances, all with histories of domestic violence. The official investigations went nowhere. I showed her Uncle Pete's map and explained about the skull I'd found. Santos studied the hand-drawn markings with professional interest. "Your uncle was documenting something," she said. "This looks like a burial map." We spent the morning using the ground-penetrating radar to scan the marked areas. What we found confirmed our worst fears. There were at least 4 distinct burial sites scattered around the property, exactly where Uncle Pete had marked his X's. "This is bigger than just Thomas Richardson," Santos said, studying the radar readings. "This is organized, systematic." As we worked, she shared what she'd discovered through her investigation. The missing women weren't random victims. They were all connected to a network of men who covered for each other's crimes, abusive husbands, corrupt officials, and community leaders who protected their own. Richardson was just one piece of it, she explained. When his wife tried to leave, they made sure she never got the chance. But she wasn't the first, and she probably wasn't the last. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Uncle Pete hadn't just known about Margaret's murder, he'd been documenting a decades-long conspiracy. Santos was calling for backup when we heard the sound of approaching vehicles. 3 pickup trucks were racing across the field toward us, kicking up clouds of dust. "We need to go," Santos said, her hand moving to her weapon. "Now!" We ran for Santos's patrol car, but the trucks reached us before we could escape. 6 men climbed out, all armed, all with the kind of hard faces that spoke of violence as a first resort. I recognized one of them from Mrs. Chen's description, the man with the scar who'd been asking about my research. The apparent leader was a man in his 70s, with cold grey eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He walked toward us, with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for his actions. "Deputy Santos," he said, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "Still playing detective, I see." Santos kept her hand near her weapon but didn't draw. "Sheriff Watkins, I should have known you'd show up." My blood ran cold. The retired sheriff, the man who would have been in charge of investigating Margaret Richardson's death and all the other disappearances, was standing before us with a gun in his hand. "You should have left well enough alone," Watkins said to me. "Your uncle was smart enough to keep his mouth shut. Too bad you didn't inherit his common sense along with his property." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Uncle Pete hadn't just documented the crimes, he'd been silenced by them. His supposed heart attack suddenly seemed far more suspicious. "Pete got too curious toward the end," Watkins continued, "started making noise about coming forward, talking to state investigators. We couldn't allow that." Santos spoke carefully, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. "There are already people who know we're here, Sheriff. This won't end with us." Watkins laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Deputy, you've been investigating imaginary crimes for 3 years. When you disappear, it'll just be another sad story about a dedicated officer who finally cracked under the pressure." That's when I noticed something that gave me hope. Santos had been recording our entire conversation on her phone. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Watkins and his men were clearly debating how to handle the situation, while Santos and I tried to find a way out that didn't end with us buried in the same field as their other victims. "The thing is," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we're not the only ones who know about this." Watkins raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "My uncle was smarter than you gave him credit for. He didn't just document your crimes, he documented them digitally. Everything's been uploaded to a cloud server with instructions to release everything to the FBI and state police if anything happens to me." It was a complete bluff, but it was all I had. Santos caught on quickly. "He's right," she said. "I helped him set it up. The files are programmed to auto-release if either of us doesn't check in within 24 hours. The lie was convincing enough to give Watkins pause. He studied us both, trying to determine if we were telling the truth. "You're bluffing," he said finally, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Maybe," I replied, "but are you willing to bet your freedom on it? Because once those files go public, every one of those burial sites gets excavated, every case gets reopened, and every one of your friends gets investigated by people who aren't on your payroll." The tension was broken by the sound of approaching sirens. Santos had activated a silent alarm on her radio when the men first arrived, and backup was finally coming. Watkins looked at his men, then at the dust cloud in the distance that marked the approaching patrol cars. "This isn't over," he said, but he was already backing toward his truck. "Yes, it is," Santos replied. "It's been over for a long time. You just didn't know it yet." The arrest of Sheriff Watkins and his conspirators made national news. The FBI took over the investigation, and what they found exceeded even our worst suspicions. The Richardson property yielded 6 bodies, all women who had been reported missing over the past 30 years. But it was Uncle Pete's real legacy that broke the case wide open. Hidden in his house, we found a safety deposit box key. The box contained detailed records of the conspiracy, names, dates, methods, and enough evidence to convict a dozen men who had thought themselves untouchable. Pete had spent the last 15 years of his life carefully documenting everything, building an airtight case against the network that had murdered the woman he loved. He'd been preparing to come forward when they killed him, making his death look like a natural heart attack. The truth about Margaret Richardson was perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation. She hadn't died in a barn fire at all. She'd been murdered by her husband when she tried to leave him, then her body burned to destroy the evidence. Thomas Richardson's subsequent heart attack had been the network cleaning up loose ends. Deputy Santos was promoted to head the new cold case task force dedicated to investigating similar networks in other rural counties. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Dozens of women across 3 states, all silenced by men who believed their crimes would never be discovered. As for me, I found myself thrust into the role of whistleblower and reluctant hero. The media attention was overwhelming, but it served a purpose. Other victims' families came forward, other buried secrets were exposed, and slowly, justice began to be served. I kept Uncle Pete's ranch, converting the barn where this all started into a memorial for the victims. Where the chest had been hidden, I placed a simple plaque, "In memory of those whose voices were silenced, but whose truth endures." 6 months after the arrests, I was still living on Uncle Pete's ranch, though it no longer felt like his. The property had become mine in more than just legal terms. It was where I'd found my purpose. The media attention had died down, but the work continued. I'd established a foundation to help domestic violence victims, funded by the sale of some of Uncle Pete's land to developers who promised to build affordable housing rather than luxury subdivisions. Deputy Santos, now Captain Santos, visited regularly to update me on the ongoing investigations. The network had been larger than we'd initially realized, with connections reaching into neighboring states and even some federal agencies. But each arrest, each conviction felt like a small victory for the women who had been silenced. "Your uncle would be proud," Santos told me during one visit. "He spent his whole life carrying the weight of what he knew. You're the one who finally let it all out." I'd been thinking a lot about Uncle Pete lately, not the quiet, solitary man I'd remembered from childhood, but the grieving lover who turned his pain into a quest for justice. His letters to Margaret, which we'd found more of in the safety deposit box, revealed a depth of emotion I'd never suspected he possessed. In one of his final entries, written just days before his death, he'd written, I failed to save you, my darling, but I swear on my life that your death will not be in vain. The truth will come out, even if I'm not alive to see it." He'd kept that promise in the end. The barn was quieter now, transformed from a place of secrets into a space of remembrance. Visitors came regularly. Family members of the victims, law enforcement officers working similar cases, and sometimes just people who needed to see proof that justice was still possible. 1 year after finding that wooden chest, I stood in the barn watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. The memorial was complete, featuring photographs and brief biographies of all the victims we'd identified. Margaret Richardson's picture held the place of honor, not because her death was more tragic than the others, but because her love story with Uncle Pete had been the key that unlocked all the secrets. A car pulled up outside, and I recognized Captain Santos's voice talking to someone I couldn't see. A moment later, she entered the barn with an elderly woman I didn't recognize. "This is Margaret's sister, Dorothy," Santos said by way of introduction. She drove up from Colorado to see the memorial. Dorothy was in her 80s, with kind eyes that reminded me painfully of the woman in Uncle Pete's photographs. She walked slowly through the memorial, reading each plaque carefully before stopping in front of her sister's picture. "I never understood why Margaret stayed with that monster," she said softly. "But reading Peter's letters, I finally get it. She wasn't staying. She was planning to leave. She just ran out of time." Dorothy turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for giving her justice, and thank you for showing the world that Peter was a good man who truly loved her." We talked for hours as darkness fell around us. Dorothy shared stories about Margaret that weren't in any police file: her love of horses, her dream of becoming a teacher, her hope that someday she could live without fear. These details brought Margaret to life in a way that evidence, photos, and witness statements never could. As Dorothy prepared to leave, she handed me a small wrapped package. "This was Margaret's," she said. "I've been carrying it around for 30 years, never knowing what to do with it. But I think she'd want Peter to have it, even if he's not here to receive it." Inside the package was a simple silver locket. When I opened it, I found a picture of Uncle Pete as a young man, smiling in a way I'd never seen in life. On the opposite side was an inscription: "My heart, always." M. Margaret had worn Uncle Pete's picture next to her heart for decades, even while living with the man who would eventually kill her. It was a testament to a love that transcended fear, abuse, and ultimately death itself. I placed the locket in the memorial case next to Margaret's photograph, where it caught the light from the setting sun. Thank you for listening to this story of love, loss, and justice. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, the truth has a way of surfacing, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let someone be forgotten. I'd love to know where you're listening to this story from. Please share your location in the comments below. Whether you're in a small farming town like this one, a big city, or somewhere in between, these themes of fighting for justice and remembering the forgotten are universal. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are more stories to be told, more truths to be uncovered, and more voices that deserve to be heard. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most important discoveries are hidden in the places we least expect to look.